Well, our next guest does some absolutely outstanding work. His new piece dropping this morning. Illegal migrants less likely to commit crime? Question mark. Guess again. I'm Pete Mundo, mornings on KCMO in Kansas City, filling in for Vince Coglianese and John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center and author of Gun Control Myths, to discuss his column, and does a great job with this topic in general, whether or not it is true, as we are told all the time, that yes, people might be here illegally, but they're not the ones committing crimes. John, what does your research show on this topic?
Well, thanks very much for having me on. Yeah, well, about a month before the election, the Biden administration's ICE sent a letter to a congressman from Texas, basically detailing some information on crimes committed by illegal aliens who had been released into the country. There's something like about 7.4 million so-called non-detained individuals that had gone through custody but had then been released. And ICE hadn't really done a very good job of checking them before they were released. And it turns out that about 662,000 of them had prior criminal histories, involving all sorts of violent crimes, from murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, as well as everything from embezzlement to fraud to you name it. And so that's 9% of those who were released. And there are a couple problems that indicate that that's likely to be a big underestimate of the problem. First of all, about 80% of those 7.4 million individuals were ones who voluntarily turned themselves in at the border. And those are unlikely to be the ones that are most problematic. The ones who are trying to avoid detection, you imagine, are the ones who have something to hide, like a criminal record. About 20% of them were ones that had been caught at the border. But it doesn't include things like so-called gotaways, people who we see coming across the border that we don't catch. And it doesn't include those that we never observed coming across the border. One of the things the Biden administration did was pull most of the border agents from guarding the border off into processing the illegals that were coming across. So they weren't watching the border. And recently, the Biden administration has finally admitted that about 30% of the passive monitoring, the cameras and other things that we have at the border that would try to monitor people who were sneaking across to kind of get a measure of the so-called gotaways, weren't working. So we had large portions of the border that had neither border agents nor any type of monitoring system to go and watch for them coming across. And God only knows how many millions fall into that category. About 2 million fall into the so-called gotaway category that's there. And so one would imagine that those are much more likely to have criminal backgrounds than the vast majority of these that were processed that had criminal backgrounds. So one of the things that we did, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please continue.
One of the things that we did, the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice, has put together measures of the cost to victims of violent crime and property crime. Everything from like medical care that they had to get, lost wages, pain and suffering. Mm-hmm. And if you assume that these criminals committed just one crime similar to the crime that ICE lists, and virtually all criminals commit many crimes that are there. I mean, your average murderer, for example, in the United States, 90% of them have violent criminal histories. But if you just take the one crime that ICE lists there and assume that they committed just one of those in the United States, what you find is that the victimization costs come to about $166 billion.
Wow.
So,
jeez.
And so there are many reasons to believe that that's an underestimate for all the reasons that I was just going through by a truly massive amount. But that's still a lot of money there.
Yeah. So what about this then? When you look at the new CBS News YouGov poll that dropped over the weekend, it was the first kind of poll that we've seen of this substance in the wake of the election results almost 3 weeks ago now. And it showed that Donald Trump starting a program to deport all illegal immigrants was at 57%. That is, if you were to listen to just more legacy media, you know as well as I do, John, you would think that the approval for that would be at like 15 or 20%, and it's at 57%. So that tells me Republicans, Democrats, across the board, people are fed up with this issue.
Right. Well, you had Laken Riley's, the conviction of her murderer last week. A lot of the media outlets from the Associated Press and the Washington Post and others didn't even refer to the murderer as being an illegal alien. But it's an example of someone who was involved in criminal gangs in Venezuela, whose record should have been picked up before he was released. Apparently, multiple times, the federal government had him in custody and reviewed his record before they released him. And yet they kept on releasing him time after time. One of the things that really differed between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is under Trump, we had remain in Mexico. And the Customs and Immigration Service would go and do a thorough background check on the individuals, including contacting their home country while they were remaining in Mexico before they were allowed to come into the United States. Unfortunately, they weren't involved in doing the background checks for the people that the Biden administration let in. They had ICE do that, and they never contacted the home countries for these individuals. And so, it's not too surprising that they would release a lot of people that we only find out later. And even that may be an incomplete list, and most likely is. I mean, one of the things that's come out from numerous agents in immigration is that the Biden administration has put pressure on agents to kind of underreport criminals coming into the country or terrorists coming into the country. And so one can only take even these numbers with a grain of salt and realize that that's just another reason why it likely underestimates the true scope of the problem.
So then what does this look like for Tom Homan, the new border czar, when he gets going in the new year? I mean, he's talking a great game. The question is, what kind of pushback will he get from states, from governors, blue governors, and from blue city mayors, where a lot of these folks are currently at illegally? How difficult is that going to make his job to do what needs to be done on this front?
Well, he's going to have a tough time. I mean, you just had a case this last week where a couple of child rapists in Boston were caught, but then released without informing ICE. One of those guys was a Brazilian who had apparently raped children in Brazil, or at least one child in Brazil. And, so if you have criminals that even the state and local governments from Massachusetts, Illinois, California, and other Democratic states across the country know that they're criminals, have had them in custody, but then release them without turning them over to ICE. It makes the job for the federal government much more difficult.
So on that note, and by the way, we're talking with John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. His new piece today, Illegal Migrants Less Likely to Commit Crime. Guess again. The Democrats obviously have a strategy around this border policy. This is not just one big mistake. Do you think there's even some buyer's remorse on just the pure numbers and the fact that they really tried to flood the system, for lack of a better word, so quickly over Joe Biden's 4 years that there might be some, well, maybe we should have slow played this thing a little bit more so the American people weren't as annoyed and ticked off and against this? Is that potentially part of what they're thinking? Do you have anybody on the inside that you've talked to on that front?
Well, one can look at what their behavior has been now since the election. I mean, people have heard about this app that people can go and arrange, to fly into the United States, not having to go through the border to get in. Mm-hmm. And one of the changes that the administration is pushing through now after the election is that when they fly into the United States, they no longer even need to meet with border agents here. We just take them at their word that everything that they put into the app application is correct. They don't have to show anything other than the information that they put into the app. But at least before, they required that they had to meet with the agent that's there. I mean, you could put in that you're a guy and a woman come in, or vice versa, and they'll just have to take your word for it that that's who you have that's being flown in.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, this is great stuff. Everybody should check out the piece by John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, and, of course, the author of Gun Control Myths. John, thank you for being here on WMAL. So appreciate the time.
Well, thank you. People can find more at our website at crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org. Thank you very much.